I'm truly delighted to introduce our first event of the festival, Disability in the Industrial Revolution, Pitmen, Politicians, Activists and Artists. A discussion with leading scholar of disability history and author of Disability in the 18th century England, Imagining Physical Impairment, Dr. David Turner, and historian, award-winning disability rights activist and campaigner, Dr. Amy Kavanagh. Over to you.
It's lovely to be here. Very excited to be at HISFest. I'm Dr. Amy Kavanagh, and with me is Dr. David Turner.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about disability history today. I'm going to leap right in with my questions, if that's all right with you, David.
Yeah, fire away.
So, disability history is kind of still treated as new territory in exploring the past. Can you reflect, David, on kind of why historians are slow to explore disability as a category of history? And why is it an important experience that we need to be including in our stories about the past?
Yeah, it's good starting points, really. Why are disabled people excluded from the histories that we write? Well, I suppose there's lots of reasons for that. One is that there's an assumption that disabled people are too marginalised to be important, or that the only disabled people who matter are people who've somehow overcome their impairments and achieved something against the odds. I think there's also a view perhaps that there aren't enough sources to study disabled people in the past, and that disabled people's experience is always hidden from history. But that's just not true, really. I mean, I think when you start looking at sources, when you start to look for disability in a wide variety of historical texts and images, then you find that disabled people are absolutely everywhere, even though they are outside of the kind of mainstream histories that we write. And it's really important to include disabled people in our understanding of the past, because disability is part of everyone's experience, really. I mean, you might consider yourself disabled now, but if you don't, then the chances are that you know somebody in your family who's disabled, that you if you live long enough, you'll become disabled. So disability history is the history of all of us.
Absolutely. I think it's important to reflect on the fact that, before modern medicine, in the type of work that people did, in the prevalence of warfare, there were many reasons to acquire disability or to exist as a disabled person in the past. What I found really interesting about your book, David, is that you talk about the fact that there's been an assumption that disabled people were not part of industrialization, and that there was this shift from disabled people being able to work and be productive in the home, but as soon as a more industrial and modern society came along, that disabled people stopped being part of the picture, and the only histories we get around disability traditionally have been about institutions. I wondered if you could kind of reflect a little bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. There has been this sort of image of the Industrial Revolution as being like a moment where it all goes wrong for disabled people. So before industrialization, people worked predominantly in the home or close to home, and this supposedly enabled people to be more integrated into social and economic life. But then industrialization, which is often seen in a very narrow way as sort of the rise of the factories, but of course industrialization is a much wider process than that, a more complicated process than that. Industrialization comes along, people are expected to work faster, to produce goods to a certain standard. They're subject to greater discipline about when they start and finish work in the day, and so this has been argued sort of pushes disabled people out of the workplace. And where do they end up? Well, the view is that they tend to be segregated in institutions, in asylums and workhouses, and so on. there's a certain truth to that, but it's by no means the whole of the picture. And what I was really surprised to find in when I was looking at the history of disability in the coal industry, which is absolutely crucial to Britain's industrial development in the 19th and 20th centuries, is that disabled people are absolutely everywhere. They are working in coal mines, they're working on the surface, they are visible members of coalfield communities, and they're there in other industrial societies as well. So visitors to the large textile manufacturing towns and cities in the north of England in the 1830s and 40s, for example, are really struck by the number of disabled people that they're encountering on the street. So rather than disability being segregated or sort of hidden away from society in the 19th century, what you actually see is something very different, actually, of disability being absolutely everywhere in industrial society, and people commenting on that and reflecting on that as a way of thinking about the bigger changes that are going on in Britain and other European countries at this time.
It's an interesting parallel, isn't it? Because as an activist over the last year, one of the things that the disability community have been pointing out is that working from home is actually very accessible for a lot of disabled people, and that many disabled people in the workplace have asked to work from home and been denied that, being told, oh, that's not possible, we can't achieve that. And then the pandemic happens, and within 2 weeks, everything's online. So it's interesting to reflect on that dichotomy about what is achievable and where work takes place. You know, it's quite a historical conversation, actually. Now, we've been using the word disability. And in my work as a disability activist, I talk a lot about something called the social model of disability. So this is the idea that disability is created by social and physical barriers rather than impairments. For example, a wheelchair user is disabled by a lack of ramps instead of stairs, not because they use a wheelchair. So in your work, have you found that there are historically different ideas about a disability, what it means, and are there any comparisons with our modern concepts, including an idea like the social model?
Yeah, I mean, ideas about disability change over time. You know, so understandings of disability don't stay the same. They change. They are shaped by the different historical contexts in which disabled people lived. So the social model of disability is something that emerges through the disability rights movements in quite recent times. In the 1970s is when we start to see that idea really being expressed and conceptualized. That was itself was a reaction to the medical model of disability, which takes a very different view, that the problem of disability resides in the individual rather than in the wider society. So you are disabled because you can't do certain kinds of things rather than because of the way society is configured. And the medical model itself is the product of certain historical processes, and the medical model isn't constant throughout history as well. I would say it's something that starts to take shape really sort of in the late 19th century, but particularly after the First World War. It's linked to certain medical developments like orthopedics. Now, when you go further back into time, which is what I'm more interested in, when we look at the 18th century and the 19th century, then these kind of modern concepts like the social model and the medical model are very difficult to apply to the experiences of people living at that time, and it's difficult to find sources that kind of fit into these kinds of modern ways of thinking about disability. But one thing that's really interesting is that the idea of disability as something which is shaped by social and cultural factors, which is a really important principle of the social model of disability, that isn't entirely new to the late 20th century. So you do find people in the 19th century talking about disability in those terms. And I've been working on a project recently with my colleague Daniel Blackie, who I think is in the audience to this event. So shout out to Dan if you're there. But Dan and I have been are interested in sort of the early history of disabled people's political activism. And so we found some writers in the early 1840s sort of talking about disability in those kinds of terms as being a problem that isn't just an individual misfortune, but it's created because of the way in which society treats people who are physically different. So one of the writers we're interested in is a man called William Dodd, who was employed by factory reformers to go on a tour of northern England. Dodd himself had worked in a factory, and he had lost his arm as a result of an accident, and so he wasn't able to work anymore in a textile factory. But he was employed by Lord Ashley, who is the key philanthropist behind factory reform, to go on this tour around northern England. And the aim was to try and get some evidence of how bad things were in factories. But Dodd went a bit further than that. He actually sought out fellow disabled people and started to gather their experiences. And he records these hundreds of interviews that he does with disabled workers, and he starts to kind of think about, well, that their problems sort of they lie beyond simple questions of working conditions in factories. It's about sort of compensation. It's about how these people are looked after the accident, how they are cared for by their communities, what role their employers continue to take in terms of taking responsibility for the accidents that have befallen them. And so, he talks a lot about compensation as being a really important issue for disabled industrial workers. And, he says at one point, we demand something better than the kind of, than the other kinds of welfare that was available for those workers. So it's really fascinating to find early examples of activists presenting disability in those kind of social, cultural, and economic terms, not just subscribing to the view that disability is an individual misfortune. These are people of their time, and they see disability quite differently to a modern social model. But they're thinking in those kinds of terms, even if they don't express it in the way that modern activists have done.
It's interesting to hear about that kind of community building, because that's something I'm very familiar with. As someone that was born disabled but became, kind of more aware of disability activism later in life. Twitter was my version of Dodd's going around, chatting to everybody. It was that kind of discovering, oh my goodness, there's a whole community out here of people with different experiences. So it's quite kind of heartening to see that experience reflected in the past. So you're saying that, we don't talk about disability in the same way as it was maybe referred to historically. This was something I found really interesting because, again, in my own work, a lot of people say, well, I'm very worried about words, like what words should I use when I describe a disabled person, or how do disabled people refer to themselves? Quite often people use euphemisms like differently abled or other kind of cringeworthy characteristics like that. There's lots of different types of language in your book and in your work about how people were described with long-term conditions, injuries, and disabilities. Can you sort of reflect on some of those words and the language and what they meant and how they referred to people?
Yeah, I mean, the language of disability is complex, historically. On one hand, it's very blunt, and people in the past use words that we today find offensive. So, common words to describe someone with physical impairment, for example, would be to call them a cripple, or to describe them as lame, and those are seen nowadays as very negative terms, particularly when they're used by people outside of the disability community. So that maybe reflects a kind of a lack of embarrassment, maybe, about talk about disability in very kind of direct terms, I suppose. That there wasn't a sort of sense of offence around certain words in the past that we have today, and a term like cripple is quite an objectifying term. It's it's bound up with ideas of of kind of incapacity, but also pity. But also disabled people are using those terms themselves to describe themselves. So going back to William Dodd, who I was talking about a moment ago, he calls himself the factory cripple, and he almost reclaims that term in the way that disabled people reclaim the term crip today as a more positive identity term. So there is a kind of we shouldn't assume that this language is simply used by non-disabled people to describe disabled people. Disabled people are using those terms themselves. In terms of the word disabled, then this is a word that's used particularly to describe someone who's unable to do paid work. And I emphasize paid work because disabled people in the past, like they do today, do a lot of unpaid work and emotional labour and care work as well. But in the past, people are very concerned about paid work. And so, and in the Victorian period, this term disabled can be used either to describe someone who's disabled from doing their normal kinds of work. So, a coal miner who's injured in an accident, who's not able to go back to cutting coal, but they're not, let's say, incapacitated from doing anything at all. Or it can also refer to total disability, so that someone is incapacitated from any kinds of work altogether. And then you get words which aren't sort of obvious disability words. And some of these are closely linked to occupation and class. So one of the terms that we see quite a lot in industrial contexts in the 19th century is the term worn out. Somebody being, imagine the body like a machine. So you do, so you're worked until you're unable to work anymore. So you're worn out like a part of the machinery. And this is a very powerful way of conceptualizing the role of the worker in this new capitalist industrial economy. And people also often conceptualize disability in terms of premature aging as well. And this is closely linked to the idea of being worn out. So, so you get a lot of commentary about workers in particular industries being worn out at younger ages. So, coal miners, for example, are seen as sort of at their peak in their 20s, but by the age of 30, they're starting to succumb to chronic diseases, particularly in coalfields like Scotland, where the coal is very dusty, and this causes a lot of lung diseases. By 40, commentators saying, well, miners are largely disabled by the age of 40. Some are carrying on in mine work, but in much fewer numbers. And then by 50, that they are at the end of their working lives, at least as far as working in a mine's concerned. So the idea of industrial works is speeding up people's life cycles, making them old before their time, is a really powerful theme in a lot of writing from that period.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I found the use of the word kind of worn out. It is really powerful. Like you say, somebody's like part of a machine, but also the way that that was associated with what became called the rest. So where if you were considered perhaps temporarily disabled or having a condition that was temporarily, you know, taking away your capacity to work, you could go for the rest, and then it was kind of a ratio between how worn out you were and how capable you were of recovering. And these ideas, it's almost like they're, you know, being sent off to recharge their batteries or how, you know, tune up the engine, which is a really interesting kind of reflection on how there is that understanding that people can recover, or people can find different function or find different capacity. And it's reassuring to it for a disabled person, you know, of the 21st century, to see disability understood in a slightly more flexible way. Because as a blind person, you know, people see a white cane or a guide dog and they assume it's a binary. You know, you can either see nothing or you can see completely fine. And it's that's kind of that understanding of those grey areas of experience seems so much more present in the 19th century, because I suppose they're a lot more common. People, you know, went through illness and impairment. And really that leads on to kind of the next area I want to reflect on, which is what I really enjoyed about the book is how it demonstrated that, you know, disability didn't necessarily mean exclusion from the workplace, and that actually there were very specific roles for disabled people that became sort of carved out as a space for disabled people being able to access work. Could you tell us a little bit more about those, David?
Yeah, I mean, just going back to your previous point, I mean, there's a real expectation that you will work as long as you're able to. As you know, this is a period before old age retirement, for example. So people are really sort of expected to try and get back into work after serious injury, for example, even if that left them impaired in some way. So so we do find cases in coal mining of men with wooden legs working underground. Sometimes they are helped by others. So in parts of South Wales, for example, coal miners continue to work in family groups through much of the 19th century. And so having your family around you might be quite helpful if you're a disabled person. And sometimes you actually have disabled miners employing others almost as personal assistants actually underground. So there's in 1842 there's a big government investigation into the employment of children in coal mines, which reveals all this kind of extent of disabled people's working in this industry. So in Pembrokeshire, where women and girls are still working underground in the early 19th century, there's one old miner who's employed his neighbour's daughter to go underground with him to help him to cut coal because he's lost his leg and he can't work as well as he used to. So you do find disabled people working underground, just going back to the same kind of work that they used to do. But of course, not everybody's able to do that. And so you also find work being found for disabled miners on the surface. So there's a very wide range of jobs at a 19th century coal mine. It's quite an occupationally diverse industry, mining, and that sort of enables people to participate in certain roles. For example, in tending the lamps that miners use. Sometimes you have cases of disabled miners being employed as knockers up. So these are people who go around waking people up in the morning. Most popular job, I'm sure, in the 19th century mining village. So these people, so men are able to kind of continue to work. And I think in terms of this idea of the male breadwinner, this is very important. Although some of this work is lower status. So another important thing about mining is that there's all kinds of work, but it's very hierarchical. And so if you're able to go back to cutting coal, then you're at the top of the working hierarchy. But if you go back to working in the lamp room, for example, that's boys' work, what younger, inexperienced workers do. So to be a sort of middle-aged miner going to that kind of work could be demeaning, even though it enables him to continue in work. And you find people going back, and disabled miners sometimes go into work in their local communities doing other work. And one thing that's really interesting is the number of disabled workers who find jobs in teaching in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So village schools are kind of have some disabled workers teaching children. There are quite a lot of disabled children in the class, actually, because education might be a way of sort of training for a different kind of work. So and this is quite an important role in a working class community. It carries a lot of status, but it's increasingly challenged as time goes on, because education becomes more professionalized as the 19th century wears on. And so these men who kind of drift into teaching because they're disabled from other kinds of work eventually get pushed out of education as more emphasis on formally educated people going into the teaching profession.
It's interesting about the fact that in the book you talk about, disabled men having to do boys' work, and that classic image for most of us that know a tiny bit or have been to a local museum about mining is that image of the small child in the dark opening a door. But actually, in quite a few cases, it was going to be a disabled older man potentially doing that job as well, which sort of leads on to my next area that I wanted to chat about, which is about how disabled people were kind of used, included and excluded from protest movements, and particularly kind of early ideas of what we would now consider like a union. So for me, as someone that spends a lot of time on social media, I often see disabled people being co-opted to forward a particular argument or to counteract a particular argument. And actually quite a good comparison at the moment is around environmentalism, and how disabled people are simultaneously excluded by some things like banning plastic straws, or then utilised to say that we should keep cars on the street instead of bikes. And I found it really interesting how disabled miners in particular had that similar experience. They sort of became almost like poster cripples of certain movements, that either they would be representing destitution and the hard labour, or they would sometimes be used as strike breakers to then actually kind of get more work. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of juxtaposition. So can you explore a little bit more of that for us?
Yeah, so this idea of the poster cripple is really interesting, I think, and disabled people are used and exploited in various campaigns today, and that's the case in the past as well. So by the time we get to the mid 19th century, where trade unions are becoming established, disability is being used to encourage people to sign up and join a union, because so trade unions use statistics about the high rates of disablement in industries like mining as the reason why men need to join the union, because actually because it's by coming together with others that they can fight for the cause of better compensation and care when disablement inevitably comes, because there's a sense that that you will become disabled if you're working in this very dangerous industry. So yeah, and then unions sort of exploit images of suffering of disabled people in their propaganda. So this is particularly evident in the 1840s in the northeast coalfield, which is one of the areas that we looked at in this project. And in the 1840s, a string of really nasty sort of industrial relations, really poor industrial relations between miners and their employers, and acrimonious disputes. So there's a big strike in 1844, for example, and during that strike, one of the tactics that employers used to try and break the morale of strikers was to evict them from their homes, because a lot of coal miners lived in accommodation that was owned by their employer. And so that gave employers quite a lot of power over workers. And so evictions do take place during these particularly long-lasting and acrimonious disputes like the one in 1844. We have other examples as well. And so the unions sort of pick up on the eviction of older people and of disabled people when they're talking about this, because it shows in the eyes of the unions, this really shows the callousness of the employers, that they aren't just evicting healthy young miners who are campaigning for better pay, but they're also evicting disabled people, throwing them out on the streets. There's a very vivid image from the Illustrated London News in the mid-19th century of miners camped on the side of a road, and one of them's a disabled man, and it's very powerfully evokes the kind of hardship that strikers faced. So these kinds of images really kind of powerful and are very kind of useful for unions in trying to garner sympathy for their cause, and it appeals to people's sense of fairness and of a kind of Christian duty of charity towards disabled people. And so so these images are exploited to a certain extent in those kinds of disputes. And when
really are, there are a lot of modern parallels with that.
Yeah.
You know, even if you think about the way that images of charity drives now, the way that images of disabled children, say for example, are used to encourage donations or to speak for an issue. It's a really interesting current that runs through art history and culture, that when you want to show suffering or indifference or inequality, that an image of a disabled person seems to be the one that you'll go to. So I think the next question I'm just going to ask to sort of draw our chat to a close, and people can put questions in the chat and through the Q&A. But at the start of our discussion, David, we reflected on disability history still being quite an under-researched topic. And certainly for me, I call myself a lapsed historian. So I used to be a historian and I left academia, and as I've been, fairly public about, it is because I found it very inaccessible, and I encountered a lot of academic ableism as a disabled historian. And more broadly, that I think there are certainly factors that we can reflect on around, why isn't there enough disability history? And not just from professional historians, but for the general public as well. And kind of what barriers are there, and what solutions do you think there are to those barriers?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk for another hour about this, Amy, I'm sure, because there are so many barriers we still need to challenge. Really, I think. Well, there are. I think one of the things is about sort of making, just as raising awareness of this kind of history. I talked at the beginning about some of the perceptions that people have about disabled people really not having a history, or only kind of exceptional disabled people having a history. And I think we need to challenge those kinds of assumptions. So it's fantastic that HistFest is starting off with an event on disability history, and that so many people are here, because it shows this is important, and it's hopefully it will inspire people to go and find out more. But it does mean that we need to kind of be clearer really about what kind of resources there are to study disability history. We need to make it more visible in not just in public history on on TV, on radio and so on, but on the internet, but also make it visible in terms of how people access it, how people can go off and do their own research, and how you actually find disability in the archives. So I said earlier that disability is everywhere, but it's not. But often, most interesting things about disabled people's experiences I found as a researcher have come from sources which aren't obviously about disability. So a lot of the things I've been talking today, but in parliamentary reports and and newspapers and things like that. So we need to kind of create tools for people to be able to access resources in archives. And so we need to make we need to have more finding guides available, and we need to make archives, museums more accommodating places, as places where disabled people see their history being represented in making that just more visible, more accessible, more welcoming. And those are just some starting points, but I think there's a whole lot more, as you know.
We do need to make public history more accessible and more welcoming, and especially heritage sites, which, by their very nature are often very physically inaccessible. But for me, there are so many simple solutions that just, if there are any heritage professionals listening, please do, get in touch, because I think, the experiences I've had compared to somewhere like the Mary Rose Museum, where as a blind person, I could actually touch the ropes that were on the Mary Rose. And then I go to Churchill's house, and the touch tour allows me to fondle a mid-20th century fish cabinet, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, was a square. And not particularly interesting to feel, and I didn't really get much information from it. So I think it's really important to reflect on how we can bring disability history to the wider public, but also to more disabled people. And that's why virtual events like this are so fantastic, because I'm here in my slippers and it's nice and accessible to me, and hopefully it's been accessible to other people too. So I think now Rebecca's going to join us and we're going to go to the Q&A.
Hello. Hopefully you can see me. That was such an illuminating discussion. Thank you, both of you, for that. And thank you, Amy, for being so generous with your sharing your experiences as well. We've got lots of questions. So the first one that I'm going to ask you has popped up from a couple of people, and it's about the intersection between disability history and women, particularly because, as one of the question askers has asked, women have lots of chronic illnesses that have not been focused upon enough in the past. So I wonder if there's anything to say about that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I'm glad someone's raised that, because I've been talking about coal mining here, which is a very masculine industry, although not exclusively. I mean, women are employed in coal mines in some parts of the country until 1842. But it's certainly true that women's experiences have been marginalised in disability history, and there are many reasons for that. One is going back to something I said earlier on about how the idea of being disabled or disabilities is so often related to paid work, which is traditionally kind of masculine sphere, and so so women's experiences are less visible there. And I think there's a tendency to, as the questioner said, that chronic illnesses aren't taken as seriously perhaps as other kinds of impairments. So there is, I think, throughout history there have been sort of hierarchies of disability and differing degrees of visibility, and the classic example being the amputee soldier or sailor, who was a very conspicuous figure, and is you know, the focus of all kinds of patriotic imagery and quite positive portrayals of disability, whereas you know, whereas chronic illness, you know, is invisible, and it tends to, you know, and you know, you know, things like chronic pain, women are today still far less likely to be taken seriously by doctors when they talk about chronic pain, or is far less likely to kind of be offered medication than men are. So there's this kind of so a whole variety of factors really serve to marginalize disabled women's experiences. So I think, you know, as we sort of try and open up disability history, looking at you know, we need to sort of pay more attention to the experiences of women, the experiences of people of colour, and others who are marginalised within disability history.
I think it's worth tooting David's horn a little bit, because he does have a whole chapter on family life and reflects a lot on the experiences of women in mining communities as disabled people, and is also still often the case today, disabled people who are caring for other disabled people. I think if you are interested in that sort of history, you know, the one area where it is quite overlapping is around mental health history. And particularly, I would say, usually middle-class women's experience of mental health care and treatment as kind of an overlapping area where disability is very, very much the focus through a lens of both feminist history, but also kind of the male gaze as a historical analysis. And there is some really good stuff about that.
And I'll just quickly follow on from that point as well. Just going deeper into, well, and David's point, I should say. Warren has a question. He says that he's a full-time wheelchair user who is also a teacher and a social worker, and he finds it, I hope you don't mind me saying this, frustrating that disability history and disability issues don't get the same level of seriousness as other forms of societal oppression. What can and could be done to rectify this? I guess it's a question for both of you.
Amy, do you want to go first on this?
Sure. I mean, I think more events like this is great. And I think that it speaks, you know, what we were talking about at the beginning of the session is that disabled people, it feels like from a lot of historians' perspectives, we were invented in the 1960s, unless we were soldiers. So I think there needs to be a bit of a turn, as the historians say. We need a disability turn. And I think that there are lots of excellent disabled historians. I think more public disability history is needed, and it is coming in there. And I know Greg Jenner is part of the programme and is a really big champion for popular disability histories, and his books feature disabled people who have disabilities, and he highlights it and says, you know, this bit is often written out as if it's an irrelevant part of their experience. So I think that's the thing. People, especially, you know, lots of more popular histories, there's still that level of discomfort around talking about disability as it being part of a lived experience. And I think that's really, you know, that's the kind of attitude we still have to break down. Like, it's not an indecent thing to mention that Josephine Baker was a disabled person, you know. Yeah,
I don't think I'd add much more to that, really. I think, you know, teaching more disability history in schools is really important, I think. And you know, I'm really interested in what happens when you look at big topics like the Industrial Revolution from the perspective of people who are normally marginalised from that story. And I think there's some really interesting stories to tell about, not just about disabled people's lives, but looking at big events from a disability perspective brings something new to our understanding of that. So, you know, more of it. Yeah.
Another question that's popped up a couple of times, and I'm afraid the original poster of this question has gone, it's scrolled up, so I can't name check, but I can name check Anne, who's asked a similar question, which is about whether we have any information or histories of people with developmental disabilities in the historical record, and if we do, what does that say? You know, what does that tell us? Anne says that she's an autistic person and particularly interested in this.
I mean, there's quite a lot from the census, because, and this is when I was talking about language before, and it's something that I have to educate a lot of people on social media, is words like idiot and imbecile, they were medical categories, like that was your condition, and these were often words used for people with cognitive disabilities. So I would say there's a lot of this kind of classic institutional histories of those experiences, both from the perspective of the workhouse and poverty, but again, also from certainly my expertise around mental health and the more middle class experience being a little bit more genteel, if you had a condition that would usually be interpreted as especially in women, would be interpreted as a uterine condition gone wrong. I don't know if you've got any more thoughts on that, David.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big topic to answer in a minute or so, but I know someone just put a message in the chat a moment ago about asking for recommendations for reading, and a book I'd really recommend if you're interested in this is a fantastic book which came out last year by Simon Jarrett on the history of learning disability from the 18th century to the present, and Simon describes a world in the 18th century where people with developmental disabilities were very much included in society, but they become disproportionately institutionalized as the 19th century goes on. Institutionalization is not a universal experience for disabled people, but if you have a developmental disability, then your chance of being institutionalized are much greater, and that's another example of differential treatment of disabled people in the past.
And this is where, as a former post-colonial historian, I could wax lyrical about categories of otherness in the 19th century and how statistics and data are used to other people. And that's why a lot of the histories of disability are institutional, because those Victorian bureaucrats loved a record. And that's, unfortunately, where a lot of that lived experience, that the majority of the historical record that has been previously examined, that's where people have gone for it.
We obviously are running a little bit short on time now, but we do have enough time to ask a couple more questions. But I'll start by an anecdote that's been given from Kate. She says that referring to disabled people teaching in northeast Shropshire, my great aunt was born without arms and taught in the 1860s. She could also sweep floors and bring in coal buckets. Which is a lovely story to have in your family history. I want to go to a question that's been raised by a couple of people about reading material specifically for school-age children. Is there anything that you could recommend? I'm putting you on the spot now.
Ooh,
or any case studies that might be good to look at that can make, perhaps if there's any young people that might be interesting case studies for school-age children.
My favourite, and it's a little bit later, and she is quite well known, but I think she's a really good example, is Rosie Billinghurst, who's known as the crippled suffragette. I think it's great because quite often, suffragettes are already in the curriculum, and with disability history, I think where possible, where you make it part of the experience and not this kind of siloed off, unique, we're going to look at disabled people now, like where you go, oh look, there, there's this movement of women, and one of them used to use her wheelchair to ram the police, which I just think, obviously I'm not encouraging children towards civil disobedience, but it's an interesting example to reflect on, of a disabled person being actively involved in a protest movement, which is not something that we get a lot of history of. So she's my favourite example for children.
So I've got another question here from Sam, and they ask, what do you see as underexplored topics in the field of disability history, or ideas that should have more focus?
That's another big question. Well, I think, yeah, as we said a moment ago, I think we need more intersectional disability histories, really, about sort of how disability connects with race and gender, sexuality, and so on. I think the most interesting work is at that interface, both in sort of in modern activism, I think, and in historical work as well. So we need a more diverse disability history, because it is, you know, it does tend to focus on white Western people, and I think that so more disability histories of the global South and more intersectional histories, I think, would be really, really useful. And also, I think more history that look into these kind of hidden experiences, such as chronic illness and chronic pain, which is an area I'm particularly interested in at the moment, and how people sort of experience disability over time through to their individual biographies. I think that those are kind of areas that I think are really valuable to explore a bit more.
I think for me, there's kind of two areas I'd like to see more of. So the first is kind of creative and artistic histories of disability beyond the kind of freak show focus, because, you know, disabled people created art and music and culture, and too often that lens is, you know, restricted to how disabled people were the subjects of the gaze. And I'd like to see more about the work that they produce. Because as ever, kind of creative spaces are often refuges for disabled people who live more unconventional lives. I think from a modern perspective, as an activist and as a lapsed historian, and this is something David's now reflecting on, is we'd love to see more modern oral histories of disability, and that really kind of grassroots movement around collecting those histories of the lived experience, the stuff that is really missing quite often from the historical record. And there's a great project in America called Disvisibility, and that is creating a huge archive of those lived experiences. And I think that's something that perhaps we might need to work on in the UK. And, you know, maybe if we can get our thinking caps on, we could make it happen.
Just because we do have a few minutes left, just to go back to the Industrial Revolution, we had a question very early on, actually, that for David, do you have any idea about the percentage of the population during this time, or that time I should say, that had a disability as compared with today?
That's, yeah, I wish I did, is the answer, as a short answer to that question, because it's very difficult to determine that. So today, just between about a fifth and a quarter of people have, this is working age adults, are disabled. There's some variations around the country. It's very difficult to say that for the 19th century, partly because although we have the census as a source, disability isn't recorded in the census, or you know, for the earlier periods, you start to get sensory impairments and so-called idiocy being recorded in the census as time goes on. But even that, you know, is limited in terms of what we can use. It's difficult, you know, even for, you know, some of the kids' industrial accidents, to get reliable figures about how many people are injured, because there's controversy about what actually is a serious accident. Coal mine owners were very reluctant to report these things, even when they were compelled to by law. And, you know, and accidents don't equal disability. So it is really, really difficult to do that. You know, so we're reliant on more kind of anecdotal accounts. But what I would say actually is in the 1830s, when people were using disability as kind of evidence for the need to reduce the hours of labour of young children in factories, there are labour activists creating their own censuses of disabled people. So there's the Macclesfield cripple census, which is not very well known, but someone actually went around the streets in Macclesfield and counted the number of so-called cripples in his community, which you can then sort of present as quantitative evidence of how dangerous silk mills were in that period. So that's also very interesting, but not enough to really answer that question.
Well, we are, I'm afraid, out of time. There are still lots of questions, but if you'd like to continue the conversation on social media afterwards, that's you know, please do so. Amy and David are both on social media, on Twitter, and I'm sure, well, I'm being a bit cheeky here, but I'm sure they wouldn't mind asking questions, she says. But yeah, use the hashtag HistFest 2021, and I'm sure we'll find those questions there. But that just leaves me to say a huge thank you to David and to Amy for holding such a wonderful conversation and kicking off HistFest 2021 weekend. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.